Again, my name is Rich Carroll. I'm going to talk a little bit about what to integrate and why. Always important are scoping decisions when you're doing any sort of API integration, error handling and data validation. Security is a common theme, and I'll get into a lot of details around that, but it is something that you will have to answer lots of questions around security. And I'm going to give you a couple of practical examples. It's probably not realistic for anybody to give you specific examples, real world, of an API integration because they're generally very specific for a particular use case, but I'll give you a couple of practical examples that we can talk a little bit more about. So the first thing is what to integrate and why. Just because you have data in one system and data in another system does not mean you need an API to integrate those two pieces. So please think whether or not you actually want to build an API or whether you can get by with even just a little piece of middleware. This is not a plug for Azuqua, but something to show you that there are other pieces of technology out there like this that are middleware, more like a plugin, at a much lower cost and also a much smaller scope. So that if you need to quickly get some information out of Dropbox or Salesforce, there might be a plugin out there that already gets you 50% or 60% of the functionality you need, and it does it today, right? Any kind of API that you're going to get into building is going to take some time and it's going to take some effort. A piece of middleware might be a good place to start, and if nothing else, it might help you prove the case for why you actually need a full API integration. Manual labor oftentimes is still more cost-effective than building custom API integrations. Assuming that you're going to be doing the ROI to validate why you want to spend money to do an API, you may do the math and find out that it's just not worth it, frankly. So don't be shocked if that's what comes up. The other thing is that business challenges are very different than technical challenges, right? The business needs are not always aligned with what IT is able to provide. So one of the things that another vendor had told me years ago that I thought was super helpful was to make sure that you're phrasing your requests in a way that the IT organization can help you. As a who, I want to what because why, right? It's a very short, simple use case, but the more that you can keep to that idea, the better chance you have of actually getting somebody to understand why you might need to move forward with an API integration. The next thing I want to chat about is just scoping decisions. Most of these factors will have an effect on your overall cost. And there's always a cost involved, whether it's external cost to a vendor or somebody to build this for you, or internal costs to get a project funded and get people to actually help you do this. So when you are actually building an API, some of the things to keep in mind are cadence. How often do you need to share information back and forth between these two systems? Is it going to be event-based, like a cron job, where you're going to run it every 15 minutes or once a day? Event-based when everybody approves an image, for example, or uploads something, or is it a scheduled sort of cadence? You also want to be careful with cadence because depending on the softwares that you're integrating, there might be licensing costs for the cadence aspect alone. I won't name names, but there are some large enterprise software solutions that actually will limit how much you can do from an API perspective, and you're only allowed a certain number of calls per day, or you're only allowed a certain amount of data transfer per day. So something you may not have considered that you'll need to keep in mind from scope. The next thing is payload. Literally, what does that data transfer look like? How are you moving information from one system to the other? Nowadays, it's either JSON or it's some sort of XML structure, but what does that format look like? You need to hammer out and get both parties to agree what that is. And because we're talking about DAM, DAM in particular generally has a file that's associated with this API, or either as a reference or actually as something that needs to be transferred. And if you're going to be transferring files, you also need to make sure that you're accounting for the validation of that transfer. When we're moving around terabytes of data, it's not just enough to say, yeah, I tossed it over the fence, go pick it up. You got to validate that it's actually there. The data itself that comes over, JSON in particular, needs to be mapped and managed. So something to keep in mind when you're scoping things out. Security. So there's security comes up in a number of different ways, but from a scope perspective, you need to allow for the labor that it takes to validate that the API is something that's allowed. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had that have really, you get 90% of the way through the project, and then somebody goes, oh wait, no, this particular thing is not in compliance. You're going to have to find another way around it. And obviously that's a huge cost impact. So make sure that you're allowing time for your security teams to validate the approach of however you want to do this API integration. License implications. Just a quick poll. How many people here have more than 2 environments for their DAM? Yeah. So that's a problem, because if you're going to be building APIs, lower level environments are not an option. You have to have lower level environments. You have to have a dev environment, you have to have test environments, and there's license implications for all of those lower level environments. Not to mention the fact there's cost associated with those lower level environments. Usually those test or dev environments are AWS or Azure-based systems, but there's a cost that goes along with that. So from a scoping perspective, you have to make sure that you have, somebody once told me that everybody's lucky enough to have a test environment. Some people are lucky enough to also have a production environment, right? The reason why you need to have those lower level environments, there's a big security reason why you have to have additional environments, but things break. And when you're building APIs, it's not a one and done type of situation. So you have to have the ability to test and validate, and so you have to have the lower level environments. And then lastly, how many calls will be made? Again, not only is there potentially a license implication, but there could also be a bandwidth implication, right? If all of a sudden you're moving around terabytes of data on a regular basis, how does that impact your normal business? I've seen a number of API integrations where the transfer itself was always pushed to after 6 p.m. local time so that it didn't affect the actual work in progress that was still happening every day. And if that's the case, if you're only going to start your transfers in the evening, is there a big enough window to actually get that transfer complete before business starts again the next day? And if that window isn't big enough, what do you do when only half the transfer gets done? So you need to have some idea from a scoping perspective of how many calls you're actually going to make. Each one of those calls in an API, it is not one and done. You basically need to transfer information between these two systems, and you need to have an error routine to check to make sure that the data you sent is correct and the data you're receiving is correct. And then what happens if that data is not correct? So is that an active notification like, hey, this file transfer failed, I want to notify the DAM administrator immediately because that's something urgent? Or is it more like a logging situation where you're just going to dump everything and somebody will look at it once a month? You may also have to tackle whether or not you want to look at an API integration as an agile approach or a waterfall approach. Right? Waterfall is nice because you get a very rigidly documented set of what you're going to address. But agile is super helpful from when you're actually building the API because there's usually a fairly iterative process to get those two different systems to talk. So you'll want to consider agile versus waterfall. And again, I just want to reemphasize, it is not a single pass of information. You send information, usually you have to process it and then go back with a refined request. Like you may need to do a query to get an asset ID, and you get that asset ID back, and now you say, okay, well now I want to know the metadata about this asset, and you get that response back. Well, now I need to understand the approval status on that asset, and you get another status back. So it is an iterative process generally in an API integration. And then lastly, from error handling, again, for DAMs, when we're transferring that information, you need to validate that that transfer happened correctly, but also what happens when it doesn't transfer correctly? How many times do you continue to try and send the half a petabyte that an account manager accidentally dumped into the system before you go, that was a mistake, we're going to stop? Security, I don't mean to be a fearmonger, but there's a lot of aspects where security plays into API integrations. Obviously, if you're trying to connect two different businesses through an API integration, that gives heartburn to a lot of IT security people, right? Because there's clearly risks associated with moving that information back and forth. You also need to make sure that you understand databases come in different flavors and varieties. And taking one set of database information and sharing it, commingling it, cleaning it with a different database is a challenge in and of itself. If any of your solutions that you're trying to build APIs into are SaaS-based, you may not be able to write a custom API into it. You may have to use their particular API calls. One of the benefits of SaaS is it's generally very supportable because you're on the same platform as everybody else. But the con to that is you're not as customizable as everybody else. You're limited in what they'll allow you to do. If you're going to be building these APIs, there's generally exceptions to firewall rules. I would say if you're going to be doing anything from an API perspective, start the security conversation as soon as possible, because it will take a long amount of time. Opening firewall rules, especially if you're in a large corporation, that may only happen once every 6 months. So you need to make sure you justify why you need that firewall opened, what port you need, and get it in the pipeline so that it gets approved, so 6 months from now they actually do what you need to do. And then lastly, this is really more a defense of IT as a whole. The default answer is always going to be no, right? That's not how you keep systems up and running and supported. You keep systems up and running and supported by keeping them stable and not changing. So when you come to them and you say, hey, I want to do X, Y, and Z, don't be surprised if they say, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. You likely will have to fight and make your business case as to why you want to do that. All right, so 3 quick examples, and these are fairly common ones that I see. Salesforce might hold a lot of CRM data, and you may need to take that customer data and compare it to a scheduling tool to see what particular tasks you're doing or what assets are associated. Then taking that same data, cleaning it up a little bit, combining it with some campaigns and maybe some other third-party info, and use that as metadata that are actually applied to the assets within your DAM. Right? Salesforce is a monster. It seems like just about everybody has some installation of Salesforce somewhere in their organization, so it's a very common tool. And Salesforce actually, frankly, has a lot of developer community out there to allow you to do this sort of integrations, but that's fairly common. I like the capture one to PIM to DAM one because that's, I think, for most people in the DAM space, fairly easy to understand. You're physically managing shirts, for example, for a retailer, right? You have a physical sample, and what you need to do is shoot it on model and then marry that information with the actual image you just shot. So I've seen a couple of customers where they literally will take a barcode scanner. There are physical asset management solutions for big photo studios to keep track of all of the shirts and the couches and the shoes and everything else. But you can scan it, scan the physical asset. It'll do a lookup in the PIM, pull the PIM information and apply it to metadata to the asset before it even gets into the DAM. Right? This is all happening at the very beginning, the creation of those assets. And then lastly, review and approval. I come from the production side of the house, so being able to actually annotate and work on those assets through a browser is a big thing. But a very common integration is actually being able to use a workflow to manage those assets up until the review and approval loop, and then capture all of the information. That review and approval loop can either happen in an external application or it can happen as like an iframe within a browser window within your DAM. But you want to capture all of the conversation that happens within that review and approval loop, and whether something gets approved, rejected, approved with changes, or approved, send to legal. Those are all metadata fields that you may want to then apply to the assets within the DAM.